Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Hey friend, I'm so excited to have you here today with me for our second episode in the Faith series. Today, I'm talking with Hillary Morgan Ferrer, and you do not want to miss this conversation. Let me tell you a little bit about Hillary to get us started. She's the founder and Mama Bear-in-Chief of Mama Bear Apologetics. She feels a great burden for providing accessible apologetics resources for busy moms. Hillary is the co-author and general editor for the book Mama Bear Apologetics, Empowering Your Kids to Challenge Cultural Lies. She has her master's degree in biology from Clemson University, and her specialties are in scientific apologetics, critiques of the Darwinian mechanism, dealing with doubt, along with identifying causes and solutions for youth leaving the church. She and her husband have been married for 12 years and minister together as an apologetics team in the local church. She can never sneak up on anybody because of her chronic hiccups, which you might hear occasionally on her podcast. So today in this conversation, you're going to hear me talk with Hillary about her leadership journey and why apologetics are important for us as Christian leaders. We also discuss the topic of doubt quite a bit, and she shares reasons why doubt is not something that we need to squelch, but rather something we need to be willing to discuss and address. And I could not agree more. So I'm excited for you to hear this conversation. I want to let you know that today's show is brought to you by Audible. And the way this works is that Audible offers you, as a listener, a free audiobook with a 30-day trial membership. If you decide to use our link to get a trial membership, it helps to support this podcast. So we really appreciate the support as it helps to cover our costs. In our episode today, Hillary mentions several books, and many of them are available on Audible. I know that Mama Bear Apologetics is not available yet, but I think it's going to be in the future. So just head over to estherlittlefield.com/audible to pick out your title today. If you decide it's not for you, you can cancel at any time, and you still get to keep the titles that you've already downloaded. So let's go ahead and jump into our conversation with Hillary Morgan Ferrer. Welcome, Hillary, to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, awesome. Well, let's just get started. And could you just tell us a little bit more about yourself?
I am currently living in Pella, Iowa, which is a small town. It's got like 10,000 people. It's like a 2-square, radius. It's but I have a hard time saying I'm from Iowa because I'm really from Texas. So when people ask me where I'm from, I'm like, oh, I'm from Texas, but I live in Iowa right now. So one day I'll claim it. I don't know. I think if you're born Texan, then you're just kind of always Texan.
I think that's true.
Yep. And I've been married to my husband for 12 years. And so I have had actually kind of several career changes. I was a professional photographer for 10 years. And then I taught high school biology and chemistry for about 6 years. And then when we got the job here in Pella, even I was finishing my master's in biology at the time. And then ironically, the job we got, I had to go back to doing Photoshop. So I worked doing images for a company here. And then the company got sold, and I kind of felt the Lord saying I needed to do Mama Bear full time. So I have been doing Mama Bear full time. That was right around when we got the book deal. So it kind of worked out like that, but we're still working on the fundraising aspect. So technically what I do for work, not actually getting quite a salary for it yet, but we're working on getting there.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. So let's just start by talking a little bit about your leadership journey. I'd love to hear kind of about how you have gotten to where you are now and maybe how God has woven leadership into your life.
It's funny. I don't even know if he really wove leadership into my life in the past. I feel like it's kind of a more of a recent phenomenon. And honestly, I think the Lord was building my character through all those many years. I feel like he had to take me through lots of schools of hard knocks to really get me to the point of where there are so many things that come after you in leadership. Anyone who aspires to leadership, I don't think understands leadership. Especially if they aspire to Christian leadership, I don't think they understand leadership, because the amount of just not only spiritual attack, but practical attack that you get when you're in leadership, you have to have a thick skin. You have to purposefully be relying on the Lord and kind of be able to tell the difference between spiritual attack and practical attack. And I think that basically the last 20 years is the Lord been preparing me for this ministry in lots of other ways. And I would kind of compare my leadership journey sort of like the Karate Kid, where it was all this stuff that I was like, wax on, wax off. I have no idea why I'm doing this, but that's what the Lord's called me to right now. So I guess I'll do it. And it wasn't until really Mama Bear Apologetics came around that it's like the Lord said, okay, this is what I've been preparing you for. And all of a sudden I saw all these skills that I'd collected throughout the years all come together in one place, and suddenly it all made sense. So I guess that would kind of be my journey. I even, thought about, why didn't I do this earlier? Because I was into apologetics as young as 12. I think I wrote my first paper on it in high school, voluntarily asking the teacher, can I make this the topic that I write on? So it's like apologetics has been in my blood since I was that young. And I thought, why didn't the Lord bring me into apologetics ministry earlier? And I kind of felt him saying, I don't think you would have been ready. I don't think that I would have known how to conduct myself in leadership with humility and not let pride get the best of me, which I think everybody in leadership would struggle with. But so he really had to take me through a lot of humbling experiences before I was able to be in a leadership position and not attribute it to myself, I guess.
Yeah. So interesting. I love hearing people's journeys because for everyone, it's a little bit different. And oftentimes I hear, I didn't even ever consider myself a leader until recently. And I think the same for me. It was not until I was well into adulthood that God kind of started showing me that's where he was taking me. So
yeah,
it's important to have that preparation time.
Yeah.
So you mentioned your book and your podcast named Mama Bear Apologetics. So
Yes.
I know there might be some listening that aren't really familiar with what apologetics is. So can you define that for us and just explain a little bit about it?
Yes. The first thing that people think of when they hear apologetics is obviously, what word comes immediately to your mind, Esther?
Apologize.
Exactly. So that's what everybody immediately says. What are you apologizing for? I'm not going to apologize for being a Christian. And thankfully, I think the word itself is starting to gain a little bit more, not notoriety, a word can't have notoriety, but familiarity, I'll say, because I've heard people making, calling other things apologists. He's an apologist for that or this or that, like in the political sphere. So I'm like, yay, people are using the word. But so the word apologetics actually comes from the Greek apologia, which was used for giving a reason or defense. It was used for early lawyers. So lawyers aren't defensive, but what they're doing is they're presenting reasons for a case. They're presenting, it's not even like a defense. I guess it depends on what kind of lawyer. It's presenting evidence for why you believe a conclusion is true. And so I find that people are apologists for lots of things in their life. It's like talk to any guy, they've got some sports team that they will tell you all the reasons why that sports team is the best, or some actor is the best, or some musician. My husband likes to get all those like obscure musicians and just explain to me how they're objectively superior to maybe someone who is classically trained. I kind of prefer a lot of the classically trained voices. He likes the real raw and gritty voices. So people are constantly giving reasons for a whole bunch of things, although usually they're giving reasons for something that's a subjective opinion.
Yeah.
What we're doing is we're giving reasons for something that we think is objective truth. And even just that concept of subjective and objective, I think our society is a little bit confused about. Did you see the movie Inside Out, that Pixar movie?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
I love the scene where they're on the train of thought and they accidentally knock over the box of facts and opinions.
Yes.
And they go, "I'll just put them wherever. It's fine." It's like, that's our society right now.
Yeah.
We don't know the difference between a fact and an opinion. And I think as Christians, we need to recognize that we are dealing in the factual realm. We're dealing in the objective realm. And if we get confused about that category from the very beginning, we can't even start to interact with culture about Christianity.
Yeah. Okay. So tell me a little bit about why you decided to start the podcast. And then later, I know you got the book deal and have written this book. So tell us why you did both of those things.
So the first off, it was just a ministry idea. Several months before, I had interacted with a ministry that was for women in apologetics, which I'm actually vice president of the organization now. And I heard someone give a perspective that I'd never heard before, which was she was talking about how there's a lot of women out there who will not read things unless it's written by a woman. And I was always a daddy's girl. I was always, loved the sciences. And so there was plenty of times where I was the only woman in the room. And so that kind of thinking never even occurred to me. And so I think that was kind of this aha moment of like, oh my gosh, we have this huge demographic that is not being exposed to apologetics. And so while my heart started kind of becoming more geared towards women, I felt like the Lord started gearing my heart towards an even smaller segment, which was moms. I noticed that there was, a lot of the conferences would have childcare, except for the apologetics conferences. The apologetics conferences never had childcare. And I was like, well, how are the moms going to come here? It's like dad's really interested already. And mom's maybe she doesn't want to debate anything. So she stays home and takes care of the kids. But honestly, it's like I had probably at least a week of sleepless nights where I just really couldn't sleep. And I had this word Mama Bear going through my head over and over and over again. And so I thought, you know what, if I can just get my thoughts down on paper, that I can go to sleep. I just want to go to sleep. That was my main goal was just, and so for about a week, I sat there and I just wrote and had an entire notebook, which basically outlined this ministry and was like, that was unexpected. I thought I didn't know where that was going. A couple weeks later, there was a conference that my husband had put together at the school that he was working for. There was an apologetics conference and I went to speak. And so one of the fun parts about speaking at the conference is that all the speakers get to sit around in the green room and have lunch together. And that year, the keynote speaker was J. Warner Wallace. And so there was maybe about 10 of us sitting in a room talking over lunch. And I just kind of had this idea for Mama Bear Apologetics. And I just decided to present it to the group. And I will never forget Jim looking at me in my eyes and saying, "Hillary, you have to do this now, and you can't wait till you graduate." I was doing my master's in biology at the time. He said, "You can't wait till you graduate. You have to do this now." So I was like, "Well, okay, I guess I'll do it." J. Warner Wallace just told me to do it, so I'll do it. So I just went out and started talking to a couple women that I knew to see would they be interested in doing this with me. And I knew I wanted to make podcasts part of the process, even though I had no idea how to podcast. But it was for the unique reason that I think moms are able to follow a conversation no matter what they are doing. Like if you try to listen to like a lecture while you're doing the dishes, eventually you're going to have to press pause and go back and write something down. But every woman, I wouldn't even say just moms, I would say women are able to follow conversations going on like in an other room. It's like this unique skill. It's our superpower. And so I thought, let's have just a conversation between two people talking through these issues, because moms need to be able to multitask. They don't have time to just necessarily just sit down and have a lecture or sit down and read a whole book, which I know is ironic now because we've written a book, but I promise I tried to make it very, very readable and not too academic.
Yeah.
So that's how that came about.
Okay.
And the book came about just because a friend of mine had published with Harvest House, who's our publisher, and was having lunch with her editor. And he sat down with her and said, "Okay, tell me about Mama Bear Apologetics. I've heard about this." And she said, "Oh, that's my friend." And so they just asked us to submit a proposal.
Nice.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen every day.
No, it really
So
doesn't. And
that's a
I
God
felt
thing.
very blessed
Yeah.
indeed.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I will say I'm reading the book right now because I'm part of the launch team. So when this podcast comes out, you guys who are listening, it's already out. You can go buy it right now. But
Mhm.
I'm reading it right now. It is very readable. Like I'm having a hard time putting it down. So
Yeah.
I would say for any of us moms or women who feel tight on time, because I think that's a big thing too for a lot of
Yeah.
us. We're super busy, and that's why podcasts are so accessible. But
Yes.
this book is also very accessible. So it's not super heavy at all. So I love that.
Thank you. That was one of my number one goals, was to
Yeah.
just how can I make this to where we're discussing the ideas and it's as easy to follow as the conversations that we have on the podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So our listeners primarily are leaders in some way. So they may
Mhm.
be leading in their church. They may be business owners. They are doing something, leading others. So I've been thinking about this, and I'm really curious to know, why do you think it's important for Christian leaders
Mhm.
to understand this concept of apologetics and to be able to defend their faith?
So I guess I will address mainly the Christian leaders right now. I really think that we have a tendency to minister in the way that we were ministered to. And so I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But if we have all the people who are doing ministry who are maybe ministered to in the same way, we have a whole demographic that we're actually missing out on. And I see this happening in the church, that the people who are interested in apologetics, often that's how they came to faith. And I would say for me personally, apologetics wasn't necessarily how I came to faith. It's how I kept myself from leaving the faith when the really tough things happened.
Mm.
I remember my first year as a teacher, going through the teacher training beforehand, and they actually taught that lots of questions could be was a rebellious technique of kids that needed to be shut down.
Mm.
And I raised my hand so fast. I was like, excuse me. Like, I mean, if someone had treated me like my questions were a form of rebellion, like I was trying to get around something, or I was trying to question authority,
Yeah.
like I probably would have shut that down, because I was a people pleasing kind of kid. So it's like we need to recognize that apologetics is important, number one, for loving people, because there are people out there who really do have these questions, and it is going to keep them in the faith. I remember a conference I was at. I think I was just attending. It was a Biola on the road, and there was this guy that got up and was so desperate the way he was talking. He was saying, "I need to understand this whole evolution thing, and can you explain genetics to me?" And the panel wasn't super schooled in that, so I actually just pulled him aside afterwards and said, "Hey, this is actually one of my areas of expertise." And he was like, "Oh my gosh, thank you so much." He's like, "I feel like I have to walk away from the faith. I don't see how these come together. I don't want to walk away from the faith, but I feel like I have to if I can't get this question answered." And so I was able to give him, like, not even a super deep answer, but at least enough to answer the question that he had. And to this day, he has thanked me over and over again, saying, "Oh my gosh, that was the turning point in my faith." And so if we as leaders assume that someone who has questions is just questioning authority, or I've heard it all. I've heard, "Don't throw your pearls before swine," that they just don't want to believe. We have to recognize that people come to the faith in different ways, and people have barriers to the faith. Not only do people have barriers to the faith, they have barriers to the barriers. So, for example, someone who has maybe suffered some sort of emotional wounding doesn't want someone to know that. No one wants to say, "I don't believe this objective fact because of an emotional wounding." That doesn't sound rational. So what do is they find a lot of things that they think are objective facts to justify the fact that they're denying an objective fact. And until you can get through those questions, you won't even reach the hurt heart that is really at the core of it. And so I really think it's a way to love people. It's a way to understand that people come to the faith in different ways. And then finally, there's a lot of personal barriers that people have and have always had throughout history. In terms, I guess, of America, we're living probably in the first time that we could really consider to be post-Christian.
Yeah.
So not only do people have personal barriers, psychological barriers, we now have cultural barriers that are raised against the knowledge of God. And that's actually why we wrote the book that we have right now, is because some people were kind of like, oh, this doesn't seem like the traditional apologetics, because traditional apologetics they think of as just, answering, did the resurrection really happen? How do we know God exists? Our barrier that we're trying to bring parents to understand, and especially other Christian leaders, is what are the cultural beliefs that are preventing that faith in the first place? And right now, stuff like postmodernism, stuff like emotionalism, the idea that my emotions can change truth, the idea that we can't look at reality and we can't look at the physical world to define reality. Reality can be defined by my subjective experience. These are the kinds of things that you can't believe in the truth of Christ if you don't believe that we can know truth. You can't believe that Jesus was who he said he was if you think, well, science is the only way to knowledge. I have to be able to put it in a test tube in order to believe something to be true. And so these are the kind of barriers we're trying to remove. And I think if what I see happening sometimes in the Christian community is they just say, well, just keep scattering more seeds. And they don't realize the rocks that are there preventing those seeds from taking root. And as long as we keep doing what we've been doing in the past, we don't realize that culture is dumping massive amounts of gravel on what we think is fertile soil. And so that to me is the number one reason why we need to do apologetics. Oh, and one last one is a lot of times people think that apologetics, the main reason is for bringing people into the church. If we were to look at this, not that church should ever be a business model, but if we want to look at people coming into the church and people leaving the church as like money coming in and money going out in a business model, it would be a horrible business model if people only were concerned with how many people were buying something as opposed to how much money was being spent, how much money is leaving. We have so many people leaving the church, leaving not just the church, but just Orthodox church. It's like they may belong to a church that has beliefs that are not traditionally Orthodox, that I'm not even sure sometimes can even be considered a saving faith, because it undermines the idea of Jesus saying, no, it's just an allegory that tells us to, be true to ourselves to the end. That's not a saving faith.
Right.
So if we ignore the number of people that are leaving the church because they're not getting these questions answered, then we have completely missed the importance of apologetics as something to help people stay in the faith, not necessarily to bring them to the faith.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you've had your own personal experience with that. Would you mind sharing with us a little bit about some of the times where maybe you were questioning or where apologetics kept you in the faith?
Oh, yeah. So I'm not even sure if I could say a specific time. I've just gone through a lot of stuff. I remember sitting in church when I was 12, just writing as many notes as I could as our pastor went through the Liar, Lord, Lunatic series, which basically is kind of a foundation for critical thinking of like who was Jesus and what are all the alternate explanations and why do none of them make sense? Then the evidences for the resurrection. Our pastor went through every single alternative theory anybody had ever proposed, and I was like, wow, he's right. Nothing else makes sense. It makes so much more sense. Occam's razor, that what happened, what is as recorded in the Gospels actually happened. And then the reliability for the New Testament. I would say my little mind was blown at that point. That was the first time that I realized I could have reasons for my faith. And throughout my life, no matter what has happened, I've sorry if I get a little emotional on this one. So my mom's had cancer. I've had cancer, and I just lost my sister to cancer in October. My husband and we just because of health stuff, I can't have kids. There's a lot of things that I could be angry at God for, but walking away from the faith has never been an option for me because, number one, I don't think I was brought up to think that the Christian life was an easy walk. But number two, my faith isn't based on how I feel about things. And even whether or not I feel God is being fair or not, I can't get around those evidences for the resurrection. That really is the thing that I can't get past that. And if I wanted to leave Christianity, I feel like I would have to check my brain at the door. And that would be my personal personality type that I think there's, this is kind of a little off topic. I think there's kind of three general kind of personality types, and it depends on which personality type you are as to what kind of evidence constitutes real evidence for you. So I think we've got the thinkers, the feelers, and the doers. And again, this is very generalized. I mean, but people who are the thinkers, it's like they really want to understand something intellectually, and if they can't have that, then they're going to walk away. The feelers, who I think we have kind of a larger percentage of those in the church, can actually base their faith on maybe a really strong experience that they've had. And a lot of times those are the ones who then try to help other people come to the faith by creating experiences for them. But for the thinker, it's like that really isn't going to be the thing that makes them stick. And then the doer, I would say, would be the ones that say, less talking, more doing. How is this actually changing people's lives? And when they've seen someone's life be changed in a dramatic way, that to them will stick. So that's kind of a little bit of a background on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think as more primarily of a thinker, I would have left the faith if it were just based on how I've, trying to hold on to an experience. It just,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's something that I love that explanation, even though it was kind of, like you said, basic. We talk a lot about personality types on this podcast. So our audience will get that and how it impacts the way you receive information and how you live your life, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So I think along those lines, something that seems to be happening and what you talk about in the book is that there's a difference between basing our faith on an experience with Jesus versus basing it on the person of Jesus and like you said, the truth of the resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
So do you see that the Western church seems to be focused more on experience over intellectual truths? And if so, why do you think that might be happening?
It actually wasn't like that historically. This is actually a fairly new phenomenon, I'd say, starting in the mid-19th and then 20th for 19th, 20th, first century, as we started becoming more experiential. And so like the idea that, like, I've had several people ask me, what do you mean by basing your faith on experience of Jesus as opposed to Jesus himself? And I've got a super duper academic analogy for you. And it's The Bachelor. TV show The Bachelor. So I don't usually watch that. I think I watched it back when I was in college because your girlfriends are watching it. So you're like, okay, I'll watch with you. And these people are going on these amazing dates. It is so easy to fall in love with someone when you're hang gliding over the Niagara Falls, and when you're kissing someone on a private island that you were just helicoptered into. Who's not going to fall in love with the person that they experienced that with? It is so easy to fall in love, but that's not really love. So it's like I remember always wondering, what happened to them when they they're now engaged. They go home and date night isn't a camel ride in Egypt. It's like going to the movies, and maybe you get sick and it's dirty socks on the floor. That's where there's not enough tandem skydive experiences in the world to solidify a love that will continue day in, day out like you need in marriage. And so I think in some ways, from elementary school up until college, I would say we have leadership who are purposely trying to create moments for kids to fall in love with Jesus. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but it's kind of like The Bachelor in the sense that we have all these moments that we can fall in love with Jesus. But at some point you have to realize once you're not having an experience, your love is going to be based on how well you know this person. So when you get out of college into the real world, no one is setting up these experiences for you. You have to come face to face with the God whom you've had all these great experiences with and ask, do I really know him, or have I just loved the experience that's been created around him? And some people discover they have no idea who he is. And so like the statistics in the youth exodus that we have in chapter 1, you'll either have people who just kind of realize, oh, it's not that important, and kind of walk away. Or you have people who are constantly chasing the next experience. They're looking for the next revival. They're asking for, something fresh with God. And again, it's like just like in marriage, we need to have date nights. We need to have good experiences, but that's not what it's based on. That's not what commitment is based on. So kind of what happens sometimes is people chasing the next experience will believe whatever a person says who's creating that experience for them. And I think that's how we historically have gotten a lot of heresies.
Yeah.
And personally, I think that's how the enemy is using just kind of this mass deception and this mass delusion that we see going on in this period of time that we're in. So they want that emotional experience, but they don't know reasons why, say, a good God would allow suffering. They can't explain to you why they think the resurrection, the foundation of Christianity, why we have good reasons to believe that that actually happened. The number of people who really have no idea why they think the resurrection actually happened, it boggles my mind. I'm like, do you realize that without that, this whole thing falls apart? So
yeah. So that kind of is related right to my next question. What happens when we, as churches, as leaders, as ministries, when we don't take, or even as individuals, when we don't take the time to develop an intellectual foundation for our faith?
Yeah.
Where does that lead us?
Oh, golly, I think it leaves you wide open for the enemy. He has so many schemes to drag people away from the faith. And I think you just leave yourself as, low-hanging fruit, shall we say.
Mm-hmm.
You'll believe anything that someone says who can give you the next mountaintop experience, whether it's true about Jesus or not. I think I have a quote in the book that says, no one's bowing down to an idol in their closet, but plenty of people are bowing down to a Jesus of their own design.
Yeah.
I think that is rampant right now. If you think that you also like just believing untrue things about him. So I actually have a talk that I do called Diagnosing Doubt, where I'm looking at some of the reasons for doubt and for people leaving the faith. That if you believe that God's desire is that you always be healthy and wealthy, you always have money in the bank and always have perfect health, God's going to feel like a liar. You're going to say, God, why have you lied to me? When that doesn't actually happen in real life, we have to look at the kind of suffering that we are to expect walking in the Christian faith. So there's some personalities for whom a very intense, real experience with the Lord, again, that's grounding that they need, and that's not necessarily bad. I just think it's a different personality type, and it's not my personality type. So yeah, I don't know. I just think we put ourselves to fall prey to so many lies when we don't know the truth, and that truth is not based on solid theology. It's kind of like, I think Hillary Short goes through in her chapter about how for currency, you have to know the people who study counterfeits, they study the actual money first. And then it's really easy to spot a counterfeit. In fact, I was talking to someone last night that she asked me, what's one thing that you probably do better than anything else? And for me, it's Photoshop. I am really good with Photoshop. And if you give me an image, I can tell you if someone has done a good job with that Photoshop. If this is a fake image, I can tell you exactly what went wrong. They didn't make the selection well enough. If we don't ground our faith in that intellectual, robust tradition, we will not be able to spot counterfeits when they come along. And again, that fits right into the mass delusion that I think it talks about that we're seeing in the end times that we are currently seeing.
Yeah. And I think, again, one of the topics you bring up in the book is discernment. And that's really what you're talking about, right? Is this ability to discern truth from a lie. And it seems like that is something that for a large percentage of Christians, or maybe a medium percentage, that we're kind of missing that discernment ability.
Well, I think not only are we missing the discernment, I think we're even the small percentage who are really trying to have discernment, some of them have bad definitions of discernment. So I think I addressed this in the book, how there's some people who see discernment as showing everything wrong in something. And I would say, does that make you the aroma of Christ or the stench of self-righteousness? Because I think that makes you the stench of self-righteousness. In the book, I purposefully wanted to define discernment as acknowledging the good and acknowledging the bad. And so we have to recognize, especially with ideas, I love the passage that talks about, not to be held captive to bad ideas and empty philosophy, all that stuff, because the word captive is key. Because I think a lot of times people treat other people who have an unbiblical idea as them being the enemy, instead of realizing, no, that person is a captive to the enemy, which our war is not against flesh and blood, against rulers and powers and authorities of this dark world. The enemy has them captive with this bad philosophy. And when you take aim at the captive, like any police force, they say if you don't have a direct shot at the captive, you don't take the shot. If there's any chance that you're going to harm the person, you don't take the shot. And so we have people that are trying to fight these bad ideas in a way that is harming the person instead of targeting the idea. And I think one of the ways you build bridges with people who have unbiblical ideas is you affirm the good that they were actually going for. Because basically every single one of the lies that we mentioned in the book has something good that someone was trying to achieve. It's just that a lie slipped in there, and then it ended up basically with the law of unintended consequences and achieving something very unbiblical, but they had a good intention. And so acknowledging that good intention first and then pointing out the bad, I think that just cannot be emphasized enough. That's how to build relationship while you're doing this.
Yeah. And I would definitely want to get more into that. I want to just go back to kind of something we touched on briefly earlier. You talked about the questions, like when you were a child, you had a ton of questions, right? And there's people in our churches, in our circles, in our friend circles who have doubts and who have questions. They may already have come to faith or they may not have. But again, I think you alluded to this earlier. There are some people that think that we just need to shut the doubt down, that it's just wrong to have doubts. How can we as leaders respond better to doubts and be more open to having those conversations?
Okay, so first off, this is funny that we keep coming back to doubt, and I'll tell you why it's funny, is when Harvest House asked me to pitch a book idea, I already had a book idea in the midst, and it was on the talk that I do, Diagnosing Doubt. So I would say just Google Diagnosing Doubt, and you're going to find a talk that I gave at the Women in Apologetics conference last year. This is a topic that the Lord has just burdened me with for people to understand doubt. And we go through some of the misconceptions of doubt and like the church. Okay. So the shutting people down with questions, people are like, oh, that doesn't really happen. No, I know people that were asked to leave a small group because they were a new believer and they had too many questions. I had a woman email me literally the other day saying, how important is it really to go to church? Because the leaders at my church are saying that when I'm asking questions, I'm questioning authority and that's not allowed. And so I told this woman, if your church leadership thinks that questions are questioning their authority, I said, you don't walk out of the church. You need to run. Run from that church and find another church. Yeah, exactly. I said, it's because she was like feeling guilty. She's like, I know I'm supposed to be in church, but I don't want to be. It's like this is how they're treating me.
Yeah.
We have to understand that this is a real thing that's going on right now. And I like to point people back to, it's like, John the Baptist is, of course, a great example. But in terms of is doubt itself sin, I like to point people to Genesis. Because we look at the only way, as a good scientist here, the only way to really understand what is affecting something is to only have one variable. And so we can look at when sin entered the world. And you look at when Adam and Eve, they had a lot of questions that they weren't necessarily bringing to God, but they were questioning between themselves. They were being lied to by the serpent. If you notice, they didn't notice that they were naked during that time. What does this tell us? It tells us that the questions themselves were not sin. If that had been sin, as soon as they started questioning, that's when they would have figured out, oops, we're naked. No, sin entered the world when they acted upon those questions and those doubts. And when they disobeyed God, that was sin. And that's when sin entered the world. That right there to me is definitive proof that doubt itself is not sin. But people think that either doubt is sin. I saw a quote the other day, I won't say who it's from, that said that doubt was rebellion against God, which just made my blood boil. A lot of times with doubt, people think there's some kind of hidden sin that is blocking, which all of these things, it can be. There are certain ways of doubting that are rebellious against God. There are certain ways of doubting or certain reasons for doubting that are linked to some kind of sin. And I actually addressed that in the talk. But that's why nobody wants to talk about their doubts, is because people immediately jump to like, well, what sin have you not confessed?
Yeah.
And so we've created this culture where you just keep shoving it down. And you know what happens when you keep shoving stuff down is that's what turns into an abscess, a spiritual abscess, where you have this toxic stuff that isn't allowed to give vent. And so it just festers until it basically explodes. And I think it's Fuller Youth Institute found that when it came to addressing doubts, just being able to express the doubts sometimes went a long way, not even having to answer them at the beginning, but just feeling safe to express them was one of the things that helped alleviate doubt. Now, I think we need to go a step further and actually answer the questions.
Yeah.
But there is something to be said to show that even just being able to express it helps alleviate some of that doubt.
Yeah. Yeah. I think having, as leaders, as ministry leaders, or just friends, giving a safe place for people to ask those questions.
Yes.
And not to always immediately jump to, well, let me fix this for you.
Yes. Yes.
Because we can't really fix people's doubts. We, like you said, we can provide some answers, but we can't always fix it. And I think that's often, just like with grief, I think in the Christian world, a lot of people just want to fix grief. And I'm sure you know all about that.
Oh, yeah.
I have, I talked about on episode 44, when I lost my dad, I was 13. And just that, and
you
that's
probably
when
have
I
a list of stupid things that people.
Oh, I did. I talked about on the episode the things not to say to someone when someone dies.
Yeah.
But it's that, like, we want to jump right to fixing, and we want to jump right to fixing doubt. And sometimes we need to listen and create that safe place. But then, like you, and what you provide us with this in this book and in your podcast, is so many ways to address the questions respectfully and while caring for the person.
Yeah. I can give you an example of a time when, so like I talked earlier about, we've got barriers to faith, and sometimes we have barriers to the barriers. We have some friends in the Charlotte area, because my husband's from that area, that said, I have this friend that just has all these questions. I have no idea how to answer them. Will you come and answer? And so John and I are like, sure, we live for this kind of stuff. And for, I kid you not, about 2 hours, she just question after question after question. And we could not get an answer out before she was moving on to the next question, which that right there is a sign that the question's not is not the problem. And after like 2 hours of like literally answering everything she could possibly think of, I think John said, is there anything else? And she looked taken aback and she goes, I don't know. Nobody's ever gotten this far with me before. So I can guarantee that girl left that day saying, I just had they were able to respond to every single thing that I said. And yet I don't feel the doubt any less. That if the answers to the question are not alleviating that doubt in the slightest, that's when a person can start to be honest with themselves and say, maybe the questions aren't the problem. We have now taken away the barrier to to accepting Christ. And there can be multiple layers on this sometimes. And so that's why reason why I think being able to answer these questions is important. She had never had anybody basically call her bluff that this is not the real issue. And she left that day. Probably, I don't know what happened to her, but she had to recognize that day those questions weren't the issue.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you talk about that somewhat in that talk that you mentioned that's on YouTube, which I will put the link to the Diagnosing Doubt talk so people can just click right on it.
Okay.
But I think you talk about that somewhat, getting to like what the actual core issue is for the person. So definitely go check that out if you want to know more about this. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea of how we respond to people and how we kind of interact with people when they have the questions. And you talk about the fact that a mama bear isn't abrasive or argumentative, and that she uses gentleness and respect when discussing the reasons for our faith.
Yep.
And there's 3 things that I see happening online, mostly because I think social media and the internet is
it's
a
the
place where
anonymity
people,
of it. It's like people can be like the monsters that they always were inside, but they've never wanted to do to someone's face. It's really it's really disturbing, really.
Yeah. So, but I see what happens, and this may be generalization, and tell me if you think I'm wrong, but for Christians, I think sometimes they become very, very vocal, and they just come across as bullies. They like think everybody else is wrong. We're right, and you all are idiots. And then there's people that are completely silent. Like they'll just go silent about their faith because they don't want to get into the argument, or they don't know what to say or how to say it. And then there's the other people that I think become so concerned with the love and compassion for people that they start to compromise truth in the effort to not be pegged as one of those crazy people.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that?
First off, I think I actually even addressed this in one of the chapters. I'm not sure which one it is, about the idea between being a terrifying truth teller and a compassionate compromiser.
Mm,
I got that dichotomy from my pastor growing up, as this is kind of a tendency that people will go to one of these two extremes. We've got our terrifying truth teller that says, I'm going to just lob this truth bomb and let the pieces fall where they may. The truth of God will not return void. And they don't care about what kind of carnage happens from just kind of being a jerk with the truth.
Mm-hmm.
You have the compassionate compromisers who, and again, like sometimes, and again, I think every personality type also has its flaws. I would say that the terrifying truth tellers can tend to be more of the thinkers, because they're more concerned with the ideas than they are with the people, which is, it's like, honestly, it's just a personality type, and there's good and there's bad to all of these. But then you have the people that are so concerned with the people that they're scared. Our society has made it that if you disagree with me, that's hurtful. And so they don't want to hurt somebody. And they see people, all these trigger warnings and people just not being able to handle dissenting ideas, that they don't even want to go there. So they'll either stay silent or they'll compromise. A lot of times, and that goes back to what I believe is some cognitive dissonance that, anyway, I won't go into that. That's in the Diagnosing Doubt talk.
It's in the video.
I know. I feel like we're here to talk about Mama Bear Apologetics, and I keep talking about the Diagnosing Doubt. But so I think you are correct in your assumption and your observation of this. And I think it goes back to personality. And apologetics kind of initially appealed to a certain personality type. And I don't want to go through all my thoughts on that, but that's another reason why we need Mama Bear apologists. Apologetics shouldn't be just for the people who are naturally drawn to debate. And I'll be honest, apologetics, it's the people who are naturally drawn to debate, who have been interested in apologetics. And we need, as Sean McDowell has a book called A New Kind of Apologist. I'm like, yes, we need a new kind of apologist. We especially need a Mama Bear apologist. And so we need to be training people not only in what and why of apologetics, but the how. And so that was one of my biggest goals with the Mama Bear Apologetics book, is how do we go about this? And that's why I have an entire chapter dedicated to discernment and how do we do this. One of our Mama Bears, Lindsay Medenwalt, her husband, Jay, is very into psychology and just integrating psychology into apologetics. In fact, he got accepted for a PhD program at Baylor for social psychology. And he's planning on using that to bring psychology into apologetics, which I think is fabulous. But I'm starting to forget the original question. Okay.
I didn't actually end up asking the question. We just jumped right in. But let me ask, I don't know if it'll make sense, but it was, how can we defend our faith in a way that doesn't come across as abrasive? So you can answer that.
No, that's good. I think one of the best ways is to ask questions. And there's I don't know. Do you know who Dennis Prager is?
I don't.
Okay. So he's a political talk show host, and I love, he's very friendly to the Christian worldview, but he himself is Jewish. And so, he always talks about how he prefers clarity over agreement. And so I compare apologists. I love this analogy. I compare apologists to the hyper little dogs that piddle on your carpet when company comes over. So they get just a little bit of apologetics training, and they're just so excited to share all of their answers that they can't hold it in. It just, comes out. So apologetics is ultimately about understanding the barriers that prevents a person from being able to accept the truth of Christianity and trying to remove those barriers. So Mama Bear Apologetics, the book specifically right now, is trying to understand the cultural barriers that culture has set up against the knowledge of Christ. And so often what people think is the problem isn't actually the problem, and you need to establish a relationship before you can ultimately know where the main issue is coming from. And I think that asking people to clarify why they believe what they believe is important, because I think the Mama Bear book is really good with equipping women to start seeing the hidden messages that people are ascribing to that they don't realize that they're ascribing to, and saying, oh, will you explain that a little bit more for me? And half the time, when you get that clarity, people can recognize, oh yeah, that really isn't consistent, or oh yeah, that really doesn't work in the real world. But this idea like science is the only way to knowledge. Oh, how did you get that idea? Well, eventually they're going to have to realize, oh, I didn't get that idea by studying science. As a philosophical statement. So yeah, you're right. I guess that doesn't apply. Or they may be talking about how, well, I think that people should just be true to themselves. And it's like, oh, well, what do you think about the people who were born with a tendency towards pedophilia? It's like, should they be true to themselves? Or you have other people who are, what about the person who gets personal pleasure, or good is what, brings someone pleasure? Well, what about the people who get pleasure from hurting other people? Because let's be honest, there are people who get legitimate pleasure from hurting people. Can we say that's good? Or what about, oh, well, good is just the majority of opinion for a culture. We can't judge another culture. Okay, so was Martin Luther King wrong? Because he went against the majority culture. You start just kind of asking questions, and you start clarifying what their actual position is. And you can do it in a way, and I think women are especially good at doing this, in a way that is a little bit less threatening than someone who asks a question and you can tell they're trying to make a point with the question. Don't do that. I think that's a tricky way of making an assertion, but it's like passive aggressive. You're making a claim, but you're making it sound like a question. But I think that's one of the ways, is just to understand where people are coming from, brings in that humility and that grace. And sometimes you realize you agree on more than you thought you did, and you were just misunderstanding the other person. And again, that's where Dennis Prager would say clarity over agreement. Once we can clarify what our positions are, that actually leads to mutual understanding that's better than people don't clarify and just agree.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so valuable. And I think that one of the points you made in the book was about that apologists people think that apologists should be doing most of the talking, but it actually is that we should be doing more of the listening.
Yes.
And that's really just, like you said, to be able to understand people, we have to stop and listen and truly understand what they truly believe.
Yeah. I compare worldview. So like the idea of worldview is basically how you see all the pieces of this world fitting together. Ultimately, it can be boiled down to, I think it's like origins. How did we get here? What went wrong? And what do we do to fix it? Would be like a real shorthand of saying what a worldview is. In order to figure out what someone's worldview is, you need to start asking them lots of questions. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? Before you can start dissecting their worldview, you have to understand what their worldview is. You can't say, oh, well, I immediately know you think this or you think that. And then you start correcting things that they're like, I don't even believe that. Or they may not realize that they believe it. And at that point, they don't want to talk to you anymore. And so just kind of like, not only are we putting our worldview puzzles together and hopefully trying to do it based on scripture, but in order to interact with someone else, we got to get an accurate picture of what they believe, why they believe it, and where that's coming from. And then we can start addressing, it looks like this part doesn't really fit. Could you explain that to me? And help them to have the I call them the aha moments for themselves of, oh yeah, that doesn't work.
Oh, I love it. I feel like I could talk to you for much longer, but in the sake of time, and this leads right into this idea of, there's probably someone listening who maybe says, oh, wow, this is so important. But I have no idea where to start with apologetics. Like, I don't have any idea kind of how to just even go about being able to have those conversations and know what to say when after I ask the questions. So what would you say to that woman who, has a strong faith, believes in Jesus, wants to share in a respectful way, but doesn't really know where to get started?
Yeah. I would say still one of my favorite books for just the specific questions, the real basic kind of classic apologetic questions of, how do we know God exists? How do we know the resurrection happened? How do we know that the New Testament was reliably transmitted? I love J. Warner Wallace's Cold Case Christianity because I feel like it really takes you through in kind of story form. I think Lee Strobel is really good with that as well.
Mm-hmm.
I loved the movie version. I think the movie was very it didn't let the story overtake the apologetics, and it didn't let the apologetics overtake the story. So the movie, The Case for Faith, I think is a really good one. If you want to understand how our society got here, where these questions are coming from, I obviously recommend the Mama Bear Apologetics book. And then if you have a woman who is trying to address this with her children, Natasha Crane has a couple of really great books out. And in fact, the reason why we didn't start Mama Bear Apologetics with the evidential stuff is that she had just come out with these books. And I was like, I don't want to write a book that just came out. Like, I want to write a different book that nobody else has written. And so hers, Keeping Your Kids on God's Side and Talking with Your Kids About God, is an excellent, excellent resource. And I think we have a bunch of resources I have a list of even more on the website, on our facts page, on the Mama Bear Apologetics. You go to About and then the facts, the frequently asked questions. I have this question of like, I'm new to apologetics. Where do I start? And I have a list of books that I recommend there. The ones that I said are on there.
Okay.
And we're still working on the resource page for all the other resources, but we're going to be tackling those slowly but surely and getting up some good resources for people.
Okay, awesome. And I'll link up everything that you mentioned in the show notes so people can go right to all those books and resources. That will be great for people. So is there anything else? I want to give you a chance if there's anything else regarding the book or apologetics in general that you feel like would be important for the Christian leader to be aware of or thinking about. What would you say to that?
Yeah. This is something that I'm just becoming more and more, convinced of. So you have kind of crazy movements in history of the pendulum swinging too far one way, and then kind of a voice of reason coming in, and then it swings too far the other way, and then a voice of reason comes in. I'm currently seeing the pendulum going really far, kind of on the crazy spectrum, and I don't see it slowing down. Now, in studying the history of ideas, I don't know how fast they were able to shut down total craziness, but I see it accelerating. And so the number one thing I would like to leave people with is that we cannot go about business as usual. We have to recognize that we are living in a time that is different. And we can't pretend that we are living in anything remotely resembling a home. We are ever more increasing living in enemy territory, and we need to be behaving as if we're and not enemy territory in the sense that, like, I don't want to say enemy. I would say more like exile. The idea that we're not raising our, if we were to use a Jewish example, we're not raising our kids in Jerusalem. We're raising our kids in Babylon.
Yeah.
And just going about all the Babylonian activities and, joining in with culture, we cannot do that anymore. We have to specifically be preparing people to be living in a place that is not their home, that is hostile to their ideas, that is hostile to Christianity, that won't reinforce their Christianity, and how to do that in a way where, again, with gentleness and respect.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably the number one thing. You have to be purposeful. And I think if that means cutting some things out of your life in order to be purposeful, then that needs to start happening, because we cannot continue with business as usual. The world that we're in now is not even the world that I was in when I was young. The speed that it's changing, and the irrationality. And that's one of the things that I would say is the hallmark of our current culture, is that it's irrational.
Yeah.
That we need our kids to understand a rational explanation. And if they don't understand a rational explanation, then they're just going to go with the tide. So that would be one of the things that has just been really burned on my heart lately.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Hillary, for this conversation. I've so enjoyed it. And I hope that our listeners really take what we've talked about and then take the next step and read the book. Go buy Mama Bear Apologetics 1, and then ask God, what's the next step? And I will just say too, I didn't mention this earlier, I meant to, but even though the title of the book is Mama Bear Apologetics, I think every single person listening should read it, mom or not. You're not a mom yourself, Hillary.
I'm not a mom myself. Yeah, that's right.
And I'm going to lead a study this summer this will be out when I'm leading it, but we're going to go through the book. And I said, this is open to all women. Like every single woman in my church is invited because this is an important topic.
Yeah.
And we need to understand it.
Oh, I would like to say one more thing for that. Number one, I've gotten a lot of emails from men that say, hey, I really like this, but more than that, a demographic that I was not expecting that has really responded to this book is grandparents. And I'll tell you why. Because the shifts in society that we talk about in the book, they have been there for that entire shift. Yeah. All the moms that currently have kids right now grew up while it was still shifting, and they may not be, they're kind of the frog in the kettle, and their kids are even more the frog in the kettle. But the grandparents are saying, where do I sign up? How can I be teaching this to my grandkids? How can I even talk to my own kids as they're teaching their kids? And I think they actually have this perspective of living through a lot of these worldview and paradigm shifts that cannot be underestimated. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. Grandparents, doesn't matter age, just start doing something. I think that call to action is important. So we always wrap up our conversations with this idea that leaders are learners. So I know you, based on all the studying and things that you've done and what you told us about your younger years, love learning. So what's something that you're learning right now? Maybe a recommendation for our listeners.
I've got 3 books that I'm obsessed with right now. Nancy Pearcey's Love Thy Body. So we were not able to get as much into stuff like the transgender and the sexuality and all that within this book, because honestly, I don't think we could do it justice in a chapter. Nancy Pearcey's Love Thy Body. Oh my gosh, it's you can't help but just be in awe of the way she's taking everything that's going on in culture and showing where we're going. It's a roadmap to where we're going, and it's not pretty. The second one would be Jonathan. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. It's Haidt, and I'm not sure if it's hate or height, but Jonathan, whichever one it is, he has a book called The Righteous Mind, where he's helping people understand the differences between the left and the right, which right now in our politically polarized climate is important to understand. And he's actually identified, he's a social psychologist as well, I believe. He's identified different values that the two hold. And so when they sit here and they're talking back and forth, they're completely missing each other. And so he's actually writing from a liberal perspective, but that's very kind to the conservative perspective, because he steeped himself in that world to understand it. And then finally, a book that I got recently called Unjust: Social Justice and the Unmaking of America. I think the social justice movement is one of those big ones right now, where we have a lot of lies being snuck in with something that was actually originally a biblical concept. And so I think he's doing a really good job describing the problems with this. So those are the 3 books I'm currently kind of reading. I can never read just one book. I have to skip around. And then a podcast series that I just got done doing was Tommy Nelson. I don't know if you remember him. He did back in the 90s, what did he do? Song of Solomon. Yeah. That's the church my parents go to is Denton Bible Church. And he has a really fabulous series on Revelation. So a lot of the stuff where I'm talking about, I really feel like we're kind of dealing with a different time in history. I think it's very appropriate for him to be going through Revelation, and he does it in a way that is more in depth than anything I've ever seen or heard.
Oh, wow.
So those would be the things that I would say I'm currently doing and are influencing what I'm doing with Mama Bear.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again, Hillary, for joining us for the podcast. It was so enlightening, and I can't wait to just continue reading the book and sharing it with more people. So Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us on the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, would you consider leaving us a rating and review in your podcast app? This helps more women just like you find the podcast, and it also helps them to know whether the podcast would be a good fit for them. Just go to the show in your podcast app Then scroll down until you see the option for ratings and reviews. From there, you can tap to rate and write a review. It means the world to us when you take a couple minutes to do this, and thank you so much to everyone who has left a review. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.